I haven't really been doing this consistently, but I think as much as I can will be is good enough. An album I've been listening to quite recently is Paul McCartney and Wings' "Band on the Run," and "Band on the Run" is the second album from Paul McCartney and Wings that came out in 1973, and this came out in the same year as one of my other videos about George Harrison's "Living in the Material World." 1973 is actually a very full year for Beatles releases because we also have John Lennon's "Mind Games" and Ringo Starr's self-titled album Ringo. What is fascinating about Paul McCartney, I think, is that right after, and this is from just reading about it, I'm not 100% sure of how it came out, but what happened was after the Beatles broke up, a lot of the brunt of the blame was put towards Paul McCartney, and a lot of his early albums were pretty much trashed by the media, trashed by the fans, trashed by the critics. And when he was recording "Band on the Run," it was at a point when it felt like it was kind of a do or die kind of thing, where if this album was not going to be received well, he might as well just call it quits. He went all the way out to Nigeria and recorded it with Linda McCartney and Denny Lane. So what happened was when the Beatles broke up, or right as the Beatles broke up, when Paul announced that the Beatles were breaking up, it was at the same time as his press tour for his debut solo album called McCartney in 1970, and it actually came out before Let It Be. And because of that announcement, people were very negative towards it, saying that it was his fault that the Beatles broke up. So they blasted McCartney, they blasted his album with Wings in the next year called Wildlife, and then the year after that he came out with, or in 1973 he came out with Red Rose Speedway, which came out earlier in the year, and at the end of the year he came out with Band on the Run. Now, for me personally, looking at McCartney's albums, McCartney's solo album, I was a big fan of it, I think. I was not really the biggest fan, but I love Maybe I'm Amazed, which just kind of makes up for the whole album, I think. Some of them are very lo-fi kind of thing. Wildlife is pretty much a mess, I think. But also, there's some solid songs, I think. The more you listen to it, the more it kind of gets stuck in your head, but that doesn't mean it's great stuff. To some extent, it feels like an extension of, as long with Wildlife and Red Rose Speedway, it feel like an extension of the McCartney songs you'd hear in lots of these lesser Beatles cuts. But it's still a great album. If you keep listening to it, the Red Rose Speedway I think is much more salvageable than Wildlife. That is an album that the more I listen to, the more I enjoy, and I disagree with a lot of the critical bashing of it, but I think it needs some kind of reassessment. It's actually not that bad of an album. My Love's such a great song, and there are others, but on Band on the Run I think he kind of steps it up, and for the first time, for me at least, the music there feels like its own distinct thing. It doesn't feel like Beatles throwaway song. It feels like a Wings song. It feels like a Paul McCartney and Wings song. It has its own identity for the first time, and while still incorporating a lot of what makes Paul such a great singer and songwriter. I'm a big fan of Band on the Run, the main song. It was for the first time for me when I was listening to it, where I felt like this was its own thing. So Band on the Run does not sound like a Beatles song. Jet doesn't sound like a Beatles song. Many of the songs really don't. Some of my favorite ones. The thing about this album, I think it also just flows very well. You get the first side ends with Pneumonia, and then, or does it start with, and whatever. But you have No Words. You have Picasso's Last Words, which is in the kind of vein of lots of the latter half of Abbey Road or something, where you kind of, there's a little callbacks to itself. Picasso's Last Words is a great song, which calls back to Jet. In 1985 at the end also calls back to Band on the Run at the very end of the album, so it kind of has a very cyclical kind of nature to it, which makes it feel more of an album than any of the other previous ones like Red Rose Speedway or Wildlife. From what I understand, Band on the Run is supposed to be the peak of what Paul McCartney and Wings fans and audiences feel is the best of Paul. And if this is where as good as it gets, then it's pretty solid, I think. It's not my favorite of the post Beatles albums. Actually, when I think about it, I did miss one album when talking about Paul. He made an album called Ram with Linda McCartney, which I think is one of my personal favorites. I think it might be just as good as Band on Their Own, I think, or maybe not as good. I don't know. It's up there for me. I'm a big fan of Ram. It came out in '71, I think, or '72. That's a great album, I think. But yeah, so when you look at the post Beatles work, George Harrison, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr. In my opinion, I think John is the best one. Paul is probably more. I mean, he makes more music, but John has like some kind of. There's something about his personality and the way he writes and delivers his music that just feels so unique and raw and true. And he's such a great songwriter. I think much better than lyrically than Paul. But yeah, anyway, Band on the Run's pretty good. I highly recommend it. Next, I'm gonna listen to John Lennon's Walton British. I might not make a video for it, but I'm listening to lots of stuff right now, so I'm looking forward to, mentioning some more things. Check out Band on the Run. Pretty good album.